We will now begin with our first thematic session, Addressing Discrimination and Exclusion in Indian Higher Education, Gender, Minorities, and Disability. The panelists for this session are Professor Dr. Y.S.R. Moorthy, Registrar, O.P. Jindal Global University, and Senior Fellow, International Institute for Higher Education Research and Capacity Building. Professor Mansi Thaplia Navani, Assistant Professor, School of Education Studies, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Professor Dr. Shelby Bhattacharya, Associate Professor, Jindal Global Law School. Professor Dr. Galina Ruseva Sokolova, Associate Professor, Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. Professor Nisha Nair, Assistant Professor, Jindal Global Law School and Fellow, IIHED. And Professor Sarovar Zedi, Assistant Professor, Jindal School of Arts and Architecture. The session will be moderated by Professor Kathleen Modrowski, Dean, Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities.
Can you hear? Yeah. All right, well, after what I've heard about the previous session, I'm sorry if some of us were stuck in traffic. It's going to be a hard act to follow, but I think we can maintain your enthusiasm since the subject that we're dealing with is extremely important. And one that has not been properly dealt with by institutions because it cuts into the context of cultural norms, social norms, and power structures everywhere in the world. So I'm going to introduce our speakers now who are going to speak on a variety of subjects. Everyone will talk for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. I would just ask you to save your questions until the end, so will you note them down while we're waiting for the other speakers to come. All right, the first speaker that we have is going to be Mansi Navani, who is from Ambedkar, and she's going to speak about exclusion and gender.
Thanks a lot. It was a very enriching session in the morning, and two statements which Professor Chauhan gave can be a very good starting point for me. And when we think of universities, both the idea and their material reality, one comes across the context of what are the purposes universities are serving in contemporary time, and from whose perspective. So an institution reflecting on diversity and the possibilities of inclusion as an indicator of good practices or best practices is a very welcome change, and it's almost an imperative and responsibility of the institution. But the other side of this discourse is what the nation expects of the university, and what, in the larger macro policy context, are the functions that institutions, HEIs, higher education institutions, seem to be performing. So the discourse of exclusion or inclusion for the longest time has been a state discourse of extending access to communities of people. Through the 1960s and 70s, when the higher education expansion happened at an unprecedented level, particularly through the 60s, when it was expanding at almost 12% per annum, there was a big lull, a stall for over 3 decades till 2007 as a moment occurred. The 11th plan and 12th plan focused on expansion as the state priority. And when you focus on expansion, you cater to communities and people who've hitherto been outside the realm of mainstream formal education. It also happens to be a moment that coincides with the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, the moment where you move towards right to education as an act of, as a right of all young children in India. And you also come to a moment where a large number of people who would not finish school, who would not finish secondary education, will enter portals of higher education. So you're thinking in terms of what HEI as a system or higher education as a system is going to be reckoning with. So 2008-9, 11th plan and 12th plan set up as a response to this moment in the educational history of India. They start talking about 3 E's: expansion, access, equity, and excellence. And you think in terms of excellence as a cautionary note, where you're thinking of what happens to the system when it expands at an unprecedented scale, which is where the materiality of the institution juxtaposes against a very inclusive and grand idea of the university. it is in this context that I would like to also go back to two moments in the last 5 years which we have captured public imagination. As we are expanding, as we are embracing and inviting students who may not have otherwise found attendance or found space in university-like spaces on account of merit. When you're saying that there'll be greater number of institutions that will promise access and also success, at that moment you come to narratives which also show limitations of what HEIs work with, which are very much part of their material realities. So two of these episodes I'll refer to. First episode is the Rohit Vemula suicide of 2016. As a PhD scholar in a prominent central university of Hyderabad, it coalesced and generated a public discourse on about how exclusionary higher education spaces can be. The coalition so I'm trying to position exclusion and inclusion as a state discourse as opposed to exclusion and inclusion as a discourse of assertion of minorities' identities, of marginalized communities' assertion of exclusion or experience of exclusion within the higher education space. It is also a moment which makes the academia reflect inwards about where is the disjunct between meritocracy and the promise of social mobility. So where are we faltering? The second moment is that of the Me Too movement, which has we are surrounded by still, but in the last 1 year when we started thinking about sexism and harassment in academic spaces, and what does that mean to create in terms of the asymmetry of gendered experience of women in academic spaces? Does that story have any bearing on how women progress in higher education and academia in the world in general and India in specific? So when you go back to statistics, and I'm sure many of the panelists sitting here will focus more on that, you find at undergraduate level there is almost parity. You have 47%, close to 47% enrollments overall in higher education for women, and it seems a very nice figure comparison to what you started out with. But the problematic of this figure you can unpack it by disaggregating it. What happens as women progress from undergraduate spaces to postgraduate spaces, from postgraduate spaces to research, and then from research to academia? If you think in terms of number of faculty positions, there are about 64 women faculty as compared for every 100 male faculty in the country. This is at an assistant professor level, and then as you go forward, this ratio or this comparison gets distorted. So many people feel that you understand it in terms of social cultural mores, that women have been tasked with doing the care and nurturing, performing those roles in society, as well as performing those roles within HEIs. A lot of administrative work. I saw the figure in JPG's, Jindal's University's book that women do occupy leadership positions, but a lot of women in academia in other universities do not necessarily occupy leadership positions, but definitely do a significant amount of administrative work. So the burden of doing the back-end work, the burden of performing a lot of caregiving, nurturing work, even within academic institutions, which is that of teaching and mentoring students, falls upon women. So traditionally, you thought these were the two major factors which impacted progression of women through academic spaces. What does it entail in context of the Me Too movement in terms of understanding, is this gendered asymmetry also sexualized, also around the politics of what Me Too movement signifies? That is that a factor to also understand why there are sticky floors and glass ceilings for women in higher education? These are uncomfortable conversations to have, and I'm not sure if this panel or this space is absolutely the right space to get into the details of it. But since we were talking about exclusion and understanding marginalities and what does it mean to be a minority in a university space, and therefore what implications does it have for an academic institution, right? So that's the primary context. The implications that it has for an academic institution is definitely in terms of its governance model. It's definitely in terms of understanding the academic governance structures in more humane and grounded terms. where you're definitely responding to the benchmark concerns of ranking, where you're responding to the parameters of diversity, of how you're meeting them, but you're also humanely understanding the context from which the people who are working for you are coming from. And then from that perspective, responding to both student assertion, to both faculty assertion, and to both identity assertions. That I feel forms in a comprehensive way the fault line on which many institutions fall by, where it's very easy to traverse a disciplinarian discourse, where it's very easy to start looking at identity politics as undermining the idea of the university, where it's very, it becomes germane, and it runs into the hand of subversive state politics, of restricting politics to itself as a non-academic domain of engagement. Because if you see from these two movements, it's not simply about politics for politics' sake. It's a politics of claiming access to that promise which the Constitution has given to the people of this country. It's also laying claim to that right which the university seem to offer, of both democratization of knowledge, access to public domain, access to national resources through constitutional means of a space like university. So we are at the, given that we are trying to shed off what N. Jairam refers to as the retailers of knowledge image, if global universities, cutting edge, excellent universities are going to drop that image of retailing knowledge, then they will have to engage and get their hands dirty and spending time on engaging with what these narratives of exclusion are about. Is it something that you grant? Is it a responsibility? And what is the nature of this responsibility then? Who will you listen to when you think about your diversity plan? Whose concerns will you take care of? How will you engender a gender-sensitive, gender-just academic space in your university? These are the conversations that can create a more progressive discourse of inclusion and sensitivity towards exclusion in academic spaces. I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mansi, and I think people will have plenty of questions to follow after you're evoking especially the issues that were brought up with gender justice and creating the space of inclusion at the universities. Our next speaker is Professor Murthy, and he's going to speak about disabilities from a human rights perspective.
Good afternoon. Non-discrimination is a cornerstone of international human rights law. And if you look at the Indian Constitution, right to equality occupies a pride of place. I'm going to confine myself to right to education and right to work of persons with disabilities. Professor Mansi mentioned about Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. It's about, basically translates into education for all. And when you interrogated this in the context of disability, and I'm going to present you some statistics. In fact, there is a huge gap between the legislative promise and the practical reality. In fact, all persons with disability are expected to enjoy the entire range of civil, political, as well as economic, social, cultural rights on par with anyone else. But if you see in practice, they face systematic, physical, mental, attitudinal, and other barriers to their full participation as equals with other human beings. In fact, when you talk about barrier, generally one conjures images of ramps, etc. But barriers can be mean many things depending on the type of disability. Barrier could mean availability of braille textbooks, audio books, availability of material in long print, or even accessible websites, or sign language interpreters in the schools, today, if you see the conditions in our education system, be it in the school or higher education system, you find that persons with disabilities are not able to realize their right to education. In fact, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted in the year 2006. Right in the first article, they chose not to define the term disability. In fact, they talked about various impairments which in interaction with social and other barriers impede the effective enjoyment of human rights. The focus is not so much on the disability per se, but it is on the barriers, the social, attitudinal, physical, or other barriers which prevent the persons with disability from enjoying the full rights. Let me first take up the higher education scenario. If you look at the All India Survey for Higher Education, 2017-18, it gives the data about the persons of disabilities who are in the higher education system. Their number hovers around 74,000. See, as per 2011 census, about 2.21% of our population is disabled. That runs to about nearly 26 million or 2.6 crore. And if you look at the World Health Organization, it says there are at least 15% of the population in a country suffer from some disability or the other. So the way our census has captured itself is a story of exclusion, is a story of disempowerment, restriction. Now, even within this limited this thing, you will find that only 70,000 persons with disabilities are in the higher education stream. Last 6 years data of All India Survey on Higher Education, if you see, it has hovered around 70,000. In some year, it was ranging from 50,000 to the 86,000. And that constitutes only 0.22% of the total persons enrolled in the higher education system. This morning, Professor Virender Chauhan mentioned about gross enrollment ratio of around 24% in higher education, and where is 24% GER for the general population, and where is 0.22%? Because the right to work is intrinsically related to the right to education. And if you start with school education, the picture is much more stark. Let's take inclusive education. How many of our teachers are trained in inclusive education? At the school level, not even 1%. So if the teacher training doesn't prioritize the inclusive education, how can the teacher bring in the required sensitization? I talked to you about the gap between the legislative promise and the reality. In fact, India adopted quickly the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, brought out a Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act in the 2016. Earlier on, in the 1995 legislation, we had only 7 categories of persons with disabilities, which followed a medical definition that a person who has less than or more than 40% of an impairment is regarded as a person with disability. But on the other hand, the 2016 Act mentioned about 21 categories, nearly 3 times more. But if you really see the way the Act has worked, you will find that the new categories of disabilities have been added, but so far, not a single person has been given a disability certificate under these new categories. And if you look at the entire disabled population, only 50% of them have been given a disability certificate. See, the moment you do not have a disability certificate, you cannot enjoy the various benefits which are laid down under the Act. And see, under this new Act of 2016, a survey was supposed to be conducted within the first 2 years. No survey has been conducted so far, though 2 years have lapsed. And the district education officer is supposed to be appointed for handling persons with disabilities. 50% of the states have not appointed any district education officers. And as regards data, there are huge gaps. Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities talk about reasonable accommodation. But how many people do understand about the reasonable accommodation? If you look at the curricula, has it been modified in practice to adjust to the requirements of persons with disabilities? The answer is no, and so therein lies the serious challenge. 45% of the persons with disabilities are illiterate. And if you look at the Indian context, this 45% is a staggering figure of many millions. And the moment, of course, the definition of literacy itself is so loose that anybody who is in a position to sign his or her name is regarded as illiterate. So that being the case, you can at once see what kind of other violations will happen to the persons with disabilities. A person will not be able to assert his or her rights. In fact, 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals have been adopted. They provide a very powerful framework for a just and inclusive society. And the word disability occurs at least 11 times across the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 4, 6, 10, 11, 17. They all emphasize about the disabilities, including the collection of disability segregated data. So, in fact, unless societies consciously work on each of these, it's not possible to usher in a just and a peaceful and inclusive society. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. In fact, if you look at the right to work, there are every year the enrollment in employment exchanges have been steadily increasing. On the other hand, the number of persons who have been placed is a pittance. Over the past several years, nearly 700,000 people have enrolled in the employment exchanges, whereas hardly 3,000 to 4,000 per annum have been placed for work. And therein hangs a very serious tale of discrimination, exclusion, and so on and so forth. And I'm leaving out the workplace environment. For instance, how often workplaces are not accessible. In fact, when you take at the school level, the government has in the Act provided for 1% reservations for visual impairment. You may reserve 1% of vacancies for visual impairment, but if you do not have sign language interpreters in schools, and if you do not consciously teach students, then the quota will remain unfilled. So thank you, Chair. I will just conclude. So basically, if you want to, as I initially said, persons with disabilities enjoy the entire range of civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights on par with others, but there's a huge disparity between the legislative promise or the promise of the convention and the practical reality. And it's one thing to sign and ratify conventions and have legislations, but it's another thing to really usher in or make right to education or right to work a practical reality for persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you for informing us and enlightening us of the different gaps that are very serious gaps for the realization of the rights of people with disabilities. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that more. In fact, our next speaker, Shelby Bhattacharya, is going to speak on disabilities, and she is from the Jindal Global Law School.
Thank you, Kathleen. And thank you, Professor Murthy, for that very, very enlightening discussion. And I must say that my talk today is going to be more about my own experience with disability in higher education. And when I rejoined Jindal, I had joined Jindal and I left for my PhD, and then I came back again. And I suffer from a condition that is progressive, so it gets more disabling with time. And when I rejoined Jindal, Professor Murthy really helped to make the environment more accessible for me. So he practices what he says. So thank you so much. Yeah, so the disabled car park, I remember we had the discussion, and then it was put right, and then the ramps as well. So there were a lot of ramps that were put because I was having difficulty accessing from the car park to the university building. Okay, so how many people, walking around Jindal, I hardly see anyone with disability. Of course, disabilities are of many types, and there are visible and invisible disabilities, and then you have physical, you have psychosocial, and you have intellectual disabilities, and it's very hard to sort of talk about them in such a broad way, but given the paucity of time, I'm just going to be talking more about my own experience, as I said. So I'll be talking about why we need to take people with disabilities more seriously and include them in higher education, what are the challenges that they face, and how universities can be made more accessible to people with disabilities. So my own experience as a PhD student and as a faculty has been that whenever I walk into class on the first day, or if I walk into a conference room, I'm the only person with a disability there. And generally, it does come as a surprise to the people around me that there is a person with disability on the other end of the classroom, or there is a person with a disability in this conference room. There are many conferences where I haven't been able to go just because it was on the top of a third floor walk up and I couldn't climb up those many stairs. So there are a lot of challenges that people with disability face, and in general, in academic institutions, disability does come as a surprise. It's not a norm, it is a novelty, and that definitely needs to change. Especially if we think of the university as a space that is supposed to cultivate the thinking of future leaders and citizens, and education as a tool for empowerment, the systematic exclusion of people with disabilities is very tragic. So according to me, just from my own experience, I feel that people with disabilities, definitely we talked about how sort of inclusivity is important because it enriches sort of the educational experience. But people with disabilities come with stories of endurance, they come with stories of strength, and they come with stories where they've overcome challenges to be where they are. And that really, in my experience, helps people who do not have disabilities to face and overcome their own challenges. So people with disabilities not only sort of add to the experience of everyone else, they also help to sort of create a shared humanity within classrooms. So for example, people might need some kind of help, or they might need certain kind of accommodations, and that automatically gets other people thinking about problems beyond their own. And that increases values like kindness and generosity that we don't otherwise sort of exercise in our very individualistic lives. More than that, disability is an essential aspect of the human condition. It makes us vulnerable. We face those vulnerabilities. When we see other people facing those vulnerabilities, we are confronted with our own vulnerabilities. And this is also an important aspect of an educational institution, which is to equip students with sort of dealing with these vulnerabilities in a sensitive and responsible way. But a lot of sort of the way that higher educational institutions are structured, with sort of the kind of pedagogical tools that we employ in classrooms, sort of with grading based on sort of these comparisons, this focus on competitiveness, on achieving certain ideals, on perfection, on being independent, doesn't leave much scope for disabled values within that framework. How do you sort of come up and ask for help, or come up and admit that you're lesser than in a framework where you're supposed to be achieving ideals or you're nobody? So disability really requires us to rethink sort of how we are approaching higher education. And one of the ways in which that can be done, so Professor Murthy talked about reasonable accommodations. So a lot of, in India, we're not by law required to make reasonable accommodations, but in other countries where you are, people with disabilities are looked at as a liability, as a cost, because those accommodations are costly and they need to be made. Rather than thinking of it as an investment into the future of the university, as you would do with any other kind of infrastructure or other project that you're carrying out for the university. So it's important to think of inclusion as an investment rather than as a cost, or as something that you just have to do because you have to do it. So the problem also with the model in a lot of higher educational institutions is sort of, and I've also seen it a little bit, is that accommodations are made, but they're made after you ask for them or after you demand them. So those accommodations don't always exist per se. It's only when someone with a disability confronts the system that those accommodations are made. Now what happens is that not everyone has sort of the confidence, or people are fearful or ashamed of their disability, so they don't want to disclose their disability to ask for accommodation. So this stops a lot of people with disabilities from even accessing or thinking about entering these spaces, because they think that they will not get these accommodations, and therefore there's no point in asking for them. So for a university to be truly inclusive, these accommodations need to be already existing. So the university should sort of already actively ensure people with disability can fit into the existing systems and structures in a smooth way, so that they don't have to keep asking for accommodations. So an example of this could be even sort of in our staff development policies, where sort of people with disabilities like me who might need sort of a caregiver to travel with them, that kind of caregiving support is not there in our policy, and that sort of stops me from even sort of going to a lot of conferences, because I think, okay, I can't manage on my own, so there's no point in going, right? So if those kind of policies are already there, that helps people with disabilities to access the system in a better way. So another example of it could be sort of equipping teachers with sort of the knowledge of what to do when they are confronted with disability. So for example, the first day of class, it is important for students to know all the things that they might, all the facilities that they might have access to because of a disability that they may have. So it is also important to encourage students to disclose their disabilities without fear of prejudice. So teachers should be actively told to be doing these things, because students also do not disclose disabilities because they're scared about sort of being graded adversely, etc. So an inclusive environment for people with disabilities has to be a mix of sort of the right policies, the right infrastructure, and people with the right kind of training administering those policies. So the person to whom you approach in a university asking for accommodations must be a person who's trained to deal with disability, rather than someone who's sort of just sort of maybe a mainstream administrator who you'll also be going to for your appraisals, or who you might also be going to class and might be teaching you in that class. So these kind of sensitivities can go a long way in sort of making the environment more accessible. I just want to conclude by saying that not everyone can be a Stephen Hawking. That doesn't mean that sort of people with disabilities do not have a place in educational institutions. So even Stephen Hawking was given a lot of accommodation. He didn't have to teach, he didn't have to do administration. He just focused on his research, right? And he says that that was what enabled him to flourish. So with the right kind of accommodations, I'm very sure that people with disabilities can flourish in different kind of educational environments. It is just about making sure that that environment and that access is given to them. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us really a very enlightening discussion that you bring in your own personal experience as well. Because sharing those experiences is something I think we do far too little, and much more is needed of that kind of exchange. Our next speaker is going to be Galina Ruseva, and she's going to speak about inclusion in a different way.
Thank you, Kathleen. Well, first of all, I would like to, I've said this before, but this is such an opportunity to be the witness of another milestone in the building of this university. To be the witness of the growth of a university is something that I did not expect that life had in store for me. It's, I feel very, very proud and happy to be able to celebrate another achievement. Now, I will take a broader perspective on the theme of this panel and of the report itself, and reflect on the concepts of diversity and inclusion. And the "and" is very important, because both are very important, and neither can be considered in isolation. So, the report has a sort of dual value focus. Not only is it important to include young people, and when I think about young people, it's not only about the students, it's also about the staff, and particularly the non-teaching staff, the hundreds of JGU employees that are employed directly or indirectly by the university. So it's that on the one hand, and on the other, on strengthening a specific kind of knowledge, skills, and behaviors which are needed to fully accept, support, and further promote differences in society. So it's a dual epistemological basis. So it's not only about our students thriving in their professional careers, which is very much highlighted in the report, but it's also about the local community, and seen in a wider perspective, a responsibility towards Indian society at large, which also Manasi pointed out. So it's important to reach out to the underprivileged group, and this has been highlighted in the report with the percentage of students receiving the Haryana domicile free concession. But outreach alone is not enough. It's also vital to equip young people and young workers with the necessary competences to successfully manage and support and embrace diversity. So I keep repeating, it's important. Why? What is that which makes it important? Now, I'll come back. I'll take some cues from my previous experience. At the university where I came from, that was in Bulgaria, I was for many years involved in the implementation of the Erasmus program of the European Union. Perhaps some of you have heard about it. Now, it's one of the oldest programs of the EU. It exists since 1984. In the beginning, it wasn't called Erasmus, it was called Socrates. And originally, it was designed to facilitate and to finance, to support financially the mobilities of students and teachers between universities in the European Union. Now, since that time, it has expanded tremendously, and now it covers a whole new range of activities. Now, the Erasmus program is an extremely costly affair. There are no obvious direct benefits for society because the beneficiaries are individuals, and still, nevertheless, it is also considered one of the most successful EU-funded programs. And its budget, from what I hear, will be doubled once more in the next program period. So why is that? How come? Well, it has something to do with nurturing that elusive and fragile thing called the European identity, which, like a delicate flower, seems to wilt, to wither down ever so quickly under the slightest nationalistic breeze these days. A very thorough study published in 2014 called the Erasmus Impact Study showed how, in the words of Umberto Eco, who published this in his column in La Stampa, Umberto Eco, the famous novelist and semiotist. So he says that the Erasmus program actually created the first generation of Europeans. And he goes even further. He says the Erasmus idea should be compulsory, not just for students, but also for taxi drivers, for plumbers, and for other workers. By this, I mean they need to spend time in other countries. They should integrate. So that is the philosophy behind Erasmus. Beyond being a scholarship program for a semester abroad, it's a powerful instrument for inclusion, shaping the minds of the young, attuning them to diversity as a part of the norm, and cultivating this elusive European identity. And that's why the European Commission doubles the budget of the Erasmus program for every new period and enlarges its scope so that young plumbers and taxi drivers now can also benefit from it. There is a growing awareness that the very survival of the European Union as a political and as an intersubjective reality, in the sense of Yuval Noah Harari, something that people believe in, may depend on the Erasmus program, among other things. Now, India may be far from the European Union, but the slogan of unity in diversity resonates just as strongly here. India is striving for unity without homogenization, striving for preserving extreme diversity within the same nation, is striving for building up a wholesome and nuanced and altogether happy sense of national identity. Unfortunately, inclusion is a much more difficult tool to use when forging national identity. Defining oneself against another and not with them is cognitively much simpler and sadly more satisfying, it seems, psychologically. There is an immediate gratification in it involved. As usual, our fate in this respect is in young people, getting them accustomed to what the report calls the uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity of a diverse and inclusive environment is our best stake against the destructiveness of identity spasms and fixations. Ideally, diversity should become trivial. It's only when banality prevails that we will be the victors in this war as a society and as human race. Yes. Now, after these inspirational words, there are still a few elements that I would like to see, since we still will need probably in the future years, diversity reports. I believe that there are a few concepts that could be included in the diversity report of JGU that would make it more valuable and its conclusions more nuanced. One such thing is to differentiate between what is comparative disadvantage and what is being called absolute exclusion factors. Because while reducing obstacles for young people with fewer opportunities is still the broader general goal, there should be a difference between both, and absolute exclusion factors should be unambiguously identified and should be dealt with, addressed with priority. Another thing is that long-term engagement programs which bring together a long-term interaction between privileged and underprivileged, such as the mentorship program and voluntary service, which are already there, should be given more importance in the future. Because before becoming a social and economic reality, exclusion is something in the minds. And long-term interaction in complex ways is very important in overcoming the reality, the mind reality. And last, just one word, also the linguistic support, which is again already present in the report, should be given a new importance, because linguistic support is not just help extended to people who do not have otherwise access to education in order to make them get a better job because now they speak English, and allowing them to make correspondences between their native language and another one. Just the very fact of language acquisitions is a factor of inclusion, because it makes you think, it makes you acquire a new set of concepts, a new system of concepts, and it makes you think differently. We think in a different way when we think in different languages. And that in itself is a factor of inclusivity. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for that, your commentary and the examples that you took from your own experience with the Erasmus program. So transferring those examples to our present context is very valuable.